political structure in check. So we have our checks and balances. Of course, the other lesson that Thomas Paine taught us was that government evolves over time. Because it evolves over time, we of course have the model that we looked at it initially last time, where we have sort of anarchy, and of course coming off that mountain, a mountain man, so every man for himself. But then as we coming down and start to see other people, maybe I can say, well, I'll share my labor with you if you share your labor with me, right? We can beat the winter snow if we both help each other, if we contribute to maybe your shelter to beat the winter snow, and if you help me build mine, right? So maybe that is just a small collection of people helping one another, maybe just not even a real village or anything, but maybe just a community. So this community is them communing, sharing those resources, sharing water, sharing food, sharing labor. So maybe they all have this direct democracy, right? So where, there's a forest fire, and they're like, okay, show of hand, who wants to move upstream or who wants to move downstream? And so the people who want to move upstream are probably like, okay, let's move upstream, so that way, we don't have to worry about, polluted, drinking water, and outnumber the people who say move downstream. So they decide, okay, show of hands, and so everybody has a say. Everyone has, has a voice. But as he says in just like third or fourth paragraph, it's soon. It's probably definitely within the first 6 paragraphs of A Common Sense. Thomas Paine talks about how, well, maybe the society becomes, or the community becomes too big, and maybe we can't meet under that one tree anymore. So maybe some of us even live too far away from the meeting place. So what we'll need to do is maybe representative democracy. I'll dispatch my son. He'll represent the family. So that anarchy evolves to direct democracy, which evolves to republic or representative democracy. And of course, that's when they basically were like, yeah, okay, we can probably keep this in check as long as we have that accountability, that transparency, keeping it small, keeping it minimized. We can basically keep an eye on what the representatives are doing in, say, the central government. But remember, they had their first constitution was in Articles of Confederation. They didn't have a centralized government, probably for that very reason, because they did not trust the centralized government. In fact, George Mason probably went so far as to even voice that when James Madison was talking about it with Alexander Hamilton. Thomas Paine's economics contributions can best be illustrated because Thomas Paine not only wrote Common Sense, he also wrote Agrarian Justice. Common Sense came in 1776. Agrarian Justice came, and it was published in 1797. So in Agrarian Justice, it reads, to create a national fund out of which there shall be paid to every person, when arrived at the age of 21 years, the sum of 15 pounds sterling, and also the sum of 10 pounds per annum per year during life to every person now living of the age of 50 years. So he's basically advocating for kind of like a stipend. But you notice he says every person, so it's universal. So technically, you could probably say this is like one of the first ideas of like what Thomas Spence was saying in 1775 about what we might call the UBI, a universal basic income. So if it is for every person, then this UBI, universal basic income, is for everyone. It's not just for those making, it's not like minimum wage, which only applies to people who make less than a certain amount. It is for everyone. Once they reach, 21 years or 21 years old, they get it. It's that stipend just to help them because they are now spreading their wings and escaping mommy and daddy's nest, so that way they can actually become their own citizen and have their own homestead. So this is what we might say is, well, one of the first advocacies for UBI. And this is 1797. This is like 25 years before Auguste Comte, who had his ideas in 1830, or Henry de Saint-Simon, who had his ideas in 1825. And this is an agrarian justice, 1797. This is 25 years before the Utopian Socialist. So when we look at Thomas Paine, he was thinking outside the box. He might not have been the first person to ask about, well, what happens to the widows, of the veterans who don't come back from war, or what about the orphans of the kids who don't have children after the war, or what about the veteran who comes back from war who's lost ears and eyes, or arms or fingers or whatever, so he can no longer care for or maybe provide for himself. Who was going to take care of these people? Maybe he wasn't the first one asking, about, what is utopian, about the perfect, compassionate government. But the thing is, he clearly was thinking ahead, basically talking about, like, well, helping support people, a crutch to people as they first, spread their wings, and basically wanting to create, because, before they actually have an opportunity to establish their own homestead, this is a way to prop them up as a crutch to help them get on their own 2 feet so they can create their own homestead, so they maybe can contribute more abundantly or properly, if you want to say, for citizenship. So in other words, it is a way, 21 years old, you now, or maybe like, you've gone to college, maybe you're wanting to help, get married and start your own family. So this, and this is supposed to, I think it's be arrived at 21 years. I think this was supposed, even though it doesn't say in this paragraph, I'm pretty sure this stipend that you make at 21 actually lasts until age 26. I think it was intended to last about 6 or 5 years. So it didn't say here, but I'm pretty confident that's what it says in the text. But even if it's not, you can clearly see, and if you read Agrarian Justice, it says, what I just read. So when you look at the evolution of, the government, Thomas Paine was basically theorizing that, there is an evolution to government. And he said this like 83 years before biological evolution. That's like 25 years before Henry de Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte. This is almost like, at least 50 plus years before even Karl Marx. But he was possibly the first true socialist. In other words, sure, you can say any degree of taxes is a social policy. Think about it. If you define socialism as the redistribution of wealth, that's what taxes is. Taxes is a redistribution of wealth, point blank. You can't get any more clearer than that. So if taxes exist within any society, that is a socialist program. People don't talk about, oh, we're extremely, capitalist in America. We don't allow for socialism. No, you don't. You do allow for socialism because you allow for taxes. So any government to properly run, how else are you going to pay for the roads and the bridges and the dams and any infrastructure that you have in society? If you want these things, if you want some of these benefits or some of these resources, like hydroelectric power, then you're probably going to end up having to have some degree of redistribution of wealth. Anyway, the Communist Manifesto came in 1848. Remember, we had that spring where you had 17 revolutions across Europe in 1848. They were linked. As I voiced to you before in one of the previous episodes, I was telling you that in my opinion, and you don't have to agree with it, but it's my opinion that the Communist Manifesto and that those revolutions were linked. I would say that it was proof or evidence for the Rothschilds insisting on that you you acknowledge or you give us peerage. Not only just to be a baronet, I want to be a full baron. I want to be peer with the queen. So of course, as you know, Queen Victoria was almost like laughed in um, Sir William Gladstone's face, and was like, he's a speculator in gold. Remember she said, and so it didn't take him seriously. But then of course they mobilized wanted to show, if you think we're a joke, we can threaten the establishment. And so they basically had revolutions across Europe. Then, of course, if you can, to look more closely at what Karl Marx was doing, okay, if we can say that a community is a group of people who come together to commune, right, to commune, and they basically are communing to share resources. Water. Why do you think we locate close to fountains or rivers or lakes, bodies of water, wells? Is because we're locating near that water source. We plan to share those resources. So if we are sharing these resources, sharing the labor, that's an economic decision. That's economics. You can say it's security, but I would argue it's economics. That's the real benefit. And of course, if you look at, say, what the bourgeoisie was, so inside the Communist Manifesto, it reads, the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with feudal or class antagonisms. By bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production, and employers of wage labor. By proletariat, the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. Engels, 1888. So Engels tried to clarify for people in that writing from 1888 what was meant by when they were talking about bourgeoisie and proletariat, what that really means. So when people say that Karl Marx had divided us into haves and have-nots, and are basically, as some people might even paraphrase, as produce into two camps, producers and consumers, technically the people who say that are right, because the bourgeoisie has replaced the monarchist, right? Because it's saying the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society. Feudal society was the monarchist, the kings and queens, the monarchs, the ruins of feudal society. So if they are replacing that, then who are they really talking about in bourgeois society? They're talking about the corporatist. They're talking about the people who own the corporations, who own the means of production. So when we're talking about the haves, we're actually talking about the corporatist. So why do they have everything? Because they have all the money, they have all the capital, they have all the way. If you want to build a factory, you're going to have to go to them to get them to finance it. So in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, was comprised of the first 5 Roman emperors: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. They were replaced by Vespasian. Vespasian, he was a general down in Egypt, and of course he spent some time as a governor down there, and he was dispatched to help quell the Jewish revolt in Palestine. And so that's where the Herods were. But Vespasian actually met and got to be friendly with a family called the Alexanders down in Alexandria. So Alexandria are in Egypt. And of course he became friends with the Herods also. These were Jewish families. So how did these people help position Vespasian to actually replace or, plant him into power? Well, it can be argued that they basically financed his rise to power. So basically, Karl Marx, if you look at the model, while socialists are saying, okay, we're sharing more resources, Karl Marx is saying, well, what if we share all resources? So, in other words, it's not on a spectrum, it's on a dial. So if we see this as a dial, right, then maybe this isn't just a political model, maybe this is an economic model. Because if you look at, say, within the Communist Manifesto, it also reads, when in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of the vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. In other words, because it will lose its political character, in other words, it's an abolition of hierarchy. In other words, you're talking about a more egalitarian structure. But then he continues, I'm going to skip down a little bit where it's highlighted. They have swept away the conditions of the existence of class antagonisms and classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. So there might be more than one way to interpret this. However, the way I interpret it and how many others interpret it, in other words, they have swept away and thereby abolished their own supremacy as a class. What they are saying is, even the CCP, even, say, the Chinese Communist Party, or the Russians, the Soviet government in say, Russia. In other words, if you to know that they genuinely were Marxist, then they would have allowed their own supremacy to wane and to subside, to abolish their own supremacy as a class. In other words, the party would cease to exist as an administrator of government. And so what how some people interpret this to mean, as I do too, that this is saying that government would become so efficient, it would be as though there was no government at all. And because this dissolution, or this basically surrendering and saying, okay, people have evolved to the point to where they can be good to one another and just to one another without being, made to do it, without being forced to do it or coerced to do it. Well, that's why some people say the model actually goes back to anarchy. So it's a full circle. So who distributes the resources in a society? Anarchy, every man for himself. So the individual is responsible for distributing those resources. Every man for himself, so I'll be the one responsible for distributing the resources. Direct democracy, what? Trade unions? Or maybe like trade companies, like East India Trading Company or something like that. So direct democracy is more or less sophisticated. In Republic, we've already seen it's more, maybe corporations. Socialism, is that where we start turning to government? I would say there's something missing in between the steps between evolution. In other words, there's got to be something other than corporations. There's got to be. So between trade unions, corporations, and government, there's got to be something else. In other words, we just haven't invented it yet, because I would dare say that the reason that we went straight to corporations is because they wanted to preserve hierarchical government. Because if you look at communism and we compare communism to capitalism, basically, I know this is an oversimplification, but if we can say for communism, and we're really trying to epitomize say, cooperation. And we're saying, okay, we want to share all resources. Then, of course, the means of production, according to Marx, was state-owned. In other words, public property. Of course, capitalism, at least the American model of capitalism, basically says, according to Adam Smith, is the epitome is, as Ayn Rand would say, it's okay to be selfish. Because your selfishness just drives your competition to be more selfish also. And so it's basically that fierce cycle where you drive me to be better, I drive you to be better. So we're basically just driving each other to be more efficient. So, and that is a very fierce, I would say, maybe deifying competition. I mean, in nature, do we find as much competition in nature? I would dare say no. But, I mean, for one thing, look at any team sport. There's got to be some cooperation just for the sport or the team to win. But for the means of production are corporate owned under capitalism. So that's where Americans maybe messed up, because we allowed them to create corporations when maybe we didn't even need corporations. But like I said, they designed corporations to be hierarchical. So why are they hierarchical? It's by design. Because it's easier if you want to basically manipulate, or if you want to control that structure, that organization, that institution. It's a lot easier to control one person, the person at the top, than it is to control, say, 10 or 20 or 1,000. So you need that hierarchical structure in order to make your control or manipulation of that structure easier. So communism encourages sharing, because like I said, that's our aim. We're basically trying to share all resources. So maybe they ration more. They're trying to regulate it in a way that is maybe somehow without market forces, basically trying to be as equitable or as fair as they can. But if you still have money in the mix, you're going to have people trying to cheat. That's why you need to demonetize. If you demonetize, then you can practically eliminate, and I mean this, you can practically eliminate the incentive for profit. So if you can eliminate, in other words, agree that, well, money, or at least the way we understand money today, is abolished. Because you don't want people cheating on the rationing. You don't want people hoarding resources just so they can sell it on the side and maybe make some more money. So basically, if you outlaw money, how else are you going to make any profit? If you're just, why would you hoard resources if you can't find a way to profit from it? If you can eliminate the profit incentive, in other words, if it is say seen as detrimental to society to even think that way, and so that way anyone who is trying to work this kind of a con job, in other words, because that's what you're talking about. You're talking about like a Soapy Smith from the 1860s, 1870s, con man. That's what, anyway, it's a confidence game. You basically are playing nice, but you're really a con artist. You're basically just in it for yourself. Like I said, capitalism, the way it's manifest now, definitely encourages hoarding. That's why we have a zero-sum problem. Because people want to say, oh, well, all the resources on planet Earth are finite. No, they're not. Especially if you're a spacefaring civilization. Hell, there's plenty of gold, platinum, palladium, all these other minerals and other resources off planet. So we could basically, as a civilization that has spacefaring, we don't have to say that anything is finite, because we have the resources at our disposal. Because get it from space, get it from the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, or like I said, there's all kind of ways of looking at this. But the thing is, the only way something can be zero sum is if it is truly finite. So if we compare communism to capitalism, we can see the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for the group. So we're basically saying, put the group first, be selfless. Capitalism, basically, like Ayn Rand said, it's okay to be selfish. So the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself. And that's pretty much a quote from Adam Smith. He didn't say group, though. He said from society. But um, John Nash, 1962, came up with the Nash equilibrium. And in the Nash equilibrium, we can basically say he disproved both Adam Smith and Karl Marx wrong. Because in other words, you can clearly say, using game theory, to show that the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group. You cannot isolate one or the other. Sure, you can say, well, taxes in American capitalism is that form of socialism that you want. I would dare say that's not enough. I would dare say if you look at, and for one thing, I would go so far as to say you really want to take away the lever, in other words, the leverage that people have over you. So that's why you need to demonetize. If you don't demonetize, you're just going to keep going with this cycle of manipulation. They're going to keep basically pushing you down, kicking that can down the road, basically saying, "Oh, you need money. You need you need this to." You're just giving them the leverage over you because they have more money than God. For one thing, they are the. If money is power, and the source of all money is the source of all power. So if they're the source of all money, where does money come from? I mean, think about it. They have basically come up with a scheme that basically people don't even know where money comes from. It comes from them. And because it's not even backed by gold or platinum or palladium or any other precious metal, it's basically just data. It's just data on a computer screen. So when you say, "Oh, well, they purchased this with this," how else did they generate all that wealth? They can basically say they printed all that money. Did they really print all that money? The elitists say trust the experts, just like Socrates said. Capitalists say trust the specialist, just like maybe Henry Ford said. When building that assembly line, he said, you want to separate labor. That redundancy, of course, is waste of resources. So if a separation of labor is, well, maximizes productivity, because the separation of labor succeeds or is successful in achieving this, right? It's not coincidence that a corporation is hierarchical. I'll just end by saying, beating up the corporations by talking about George Orwell. George Orwell in Animal Farm, he was the author of Animal Farm, the author of 1984. He basically says, and this is a quote from 1984, George Orwell wrote, "For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied, made stupid, by poverty and would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that that privileged minority had no function." Who's the privileged minority? Monarchs. And you're like, monarchs? Monarchs, why are people so naive? For one thing, a monarch and a mafioso are the same thing. A monarch is nothing but an overly romanticized mafioso. They both transfer power to their children. They both basically demand loyalty. They say they have a code of conduct, like that code of chivalry. I hate to tell you, that's probably the most ancient way of virtue signaling. That code of conduct, that code of chivalry is just virtue signaling, patting themselves, breaking their arm, patting themselves on the back, talking about, "Oh, see how virtuous we are? We're better than you. We should be the nanny state. We should be, over you. We should dictate to you how to behave. We should be, telling you how to live your life. We should control you. We are the ones who basically are better than you. We're virtuous. You're not. We're noble." That's why they even call themselves nobility, is because, again, it's virtue signaling. And you're talking about an ancient form of it. So this whole idea that the privileged minority had no function, they are the privileged minority. How many royal families exist in Europe today? 17. But all the royal families, all the monarchs today come from one man. Or you doubt that economic power is political power after what you've seen? After you've seen what lobbyists do in Washington, D.C.? After you've seen that our freedoms have been stripped away, all because somebody is basically leveraging influence in Washington, D.C. with money? I mean, just to continue, realize. So he says they would sooner or later realize that this privileged minority had no function. What does a monarch produce? So I've heard people say, well, the monarch provides us self-esteem or esteem for the empire. Really? That's your reason for leaving a monarchy intact, is because of esteem? You want a little bit of pride? Are you serious? These people are criminals. These people had a good gig going for millennia. Even the Vatican is in on it. The Vatican is a monarchist. They have their own throne. And they of course, they establish the legitimacy of any other monarch by basically saying, okay, well, I spoke to God, and God says you're ordained to be the next, king of Spain, next king of France. So, because I speak to God, he told me you're legit. Jesus, this is the kind of gig they had going for millennia, and hopefully you don't buy into this kind of crap, but they would sweep it away because they have no function, and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. So that's why I would say, even though I don't have a slide for it, I would say we probably should be thanking Martin Luther. Martin Luther was the first one to sit there and say, you all have a right to do your own research. You have a right to read your own sources. You have a right to know. So that's the reason today we can all say, I can read and write. Most of us today, if it wasn't for Martin Luther, most of us today would probably still be illiterate. We probably couldn't read and write still if it wasn't for somebody like Martin Luther who said, no, you need to, we'll print the Bible for you in your language, in German, in Spanish, in French, and all these other languages, because he said, no, you have a right to know. I'm not going to sit there and tell you what the scripture says in Latin anymore. So when we look at, say, things that are happening recently, Afghanistan's Taliban destroyed this Baniyan Buddha in 2001. Do you remember this Buddha? It was in Afghanistan. 2003, looting at the Baghdad Museum went on during the American invasion. Basically, they gutted the entire museum. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Baghdad Battery. The Baghdad Battery was a clay pot that had like acid residue. They think it was maybe grape juice or something. It has copper wiring, but it was stored at the Baghdad Museum. That thing walked out of there during the American invasion.
They started chipping away at the famous and irreplaceable winged bull at the Nergal Gate to Nineveh last week. Now the Iraqi government says the demolition crew of the Islamic State is bulldozing the 3,000-year-old site of Nimrud, one of the glories of the ancient world. The barbarians are beyond the gates, and they're wreaking terrible damage. The world was shocked last week when IS produced pictures of its vandals destroying statues in the Mosul Museum. Many of these were replicas, but at Nimrud the artifacts are original. So far there's been no video evidence, but archaeologists fear that demolition has been accompanied by looting.
So when people talk about how people are destroying or erasing history, who is erasing history? Who is it? I mean, you had ISIS, you had the Taliban do it in Afghanistan, you had ISIS do it in Iraq, you had Al-Qaeda do it, but then here's the Americans letting these precious artifacts walk out of the Baghdad Museum. So who then is seemingly erasing history? And who is they? Well, if you look on the internet, you'll find that there's this quote from, it's at AZ Quotes, Easy Quotes, I think Fancy Quotes. So there's at least 3 sites that I found it at about 10 years ago or more. One says, if you can cut the people off from their history, then they can be easily persuaded. Karl Marx. Keep people from their history and they are easily controlled. Karl Marx. Again, both of these were AZ Quote. I took them from AZ Quote. But like I said, you can find these at AZ Quote, Easy Quote, Fancy Quotes, or at least when I looked these up, say 12, 13 years ago, they were at all 3. Do the communists want to take over the world? Oh my God, those dastardly communists want to take over the planet. The thing is, though, I will be honest with you. I consider myself an intellectual. They didn't give me a date. They didn't give me a context. They didn't tell me, did he say it in writing or did he say it spoken? Did he speak these words? I wanted a date. Who was the audience? Who was he talking to? Was it written or spoken? I want something. So I actually wrote these websites and said, well, give me context. When did he say it? How did he say it? Nobody ever responded. No one ever responded to my emails. So you want to know what I did? I went and bought, I already had the Communist Manifesto. I had it in a PDF file because it's not a big document. But the Das Kapital is big. So I spent time reading that thing. At least the first 3 volumes I read through very thoroughly because those are the ones he wrote while he was alive. Friedrich Engels finished Das Kapital, the 4th volume, after he'd already died. So I don't think I ever finished the 4th volume. But nowhere can I find where he said these 2 quotes. In fact, I would posit that this is disinformation. For one thing, I read, because in this search to find out what he did say, I read all his letters to Friedrich Engels when he lived in London. And quite honestly, by listening and listening to his words and reading his words from the letters, I would say that's antithetical to the way he thought. I mean, everything he stood for, everything he believed, everything he was going, or his ambitions, were basically going in a different direction, a different trajectory than what these quotes imply. These quotes are basically saying, oh, well, I'm vying for power. No, he was basically trying to unseat the monarchs, or unseat those bourgeoisie who were basically challenging the corporatists who were taking power from the monarchist. In other words, he still saw that as very dangerous. So who then is trying to convince Americans that communists wish to take control of the world? Who's basically telling everyone that that it's the communists who are basically destroying all these artifacts? It's not the Taliban. I posit the people who started World War, or who starting World War III, are the same people who started World War I and World War II. Let's look at AZ Quotes. Who is AZ Quotes? If you look at AZ Quotes, do a who is, it basically says the restaurant's not disclosed. It was in Nassau, country BS. What is BS? Well, BS, of course, is the Bahamas. But if you notice, the government, even though it became in the Bahamas independent, like around 1973, they still have it posted that their monarch is King Charles III. Why? Why are these people still saying they have a monarch? And of course, this of course is Prince Harry. Prince Harry, he said, I will not be bullied into playing a game that killed my mom.
And for my wife, of course there's a lot of stuff that hurts, especially when the majority of it is untrue. But all we need to do is focus on being real, and focus on being the people that we are, and standing up for what we believe in. I will not be bullied into playing a game that killed my mum.
He knows what happened to his mother. His mother basically stopped the arms sales and created a moratorium for landmines. Around 1979, she did a march, and she actually walked through a minefield. She did it, and of course, it made huge publicity around the world because she put her own life at risk just to make the point that these weapons need to go. Because she said it's maiming and killing young kids. They're not just for combatants. Non-combatants are being maimed and killed by these things, and it's probably maiming and killing a disproportionate number of kids as compared to combatants even. So England, or the UK, basically did adhere to a moratorium. They did the Americans join? No, we actually refused. We're like, no, we make too much money from landmines. We're not going to join that moratorium. So we had more to lose than the UK did because we were the ones basically making money from these landmines. The thing is it's my understanding is that cluster bombs was the next thing on her agenda. She basically wanted a moratorium on cluster bombs too, because she said these things are also have a lot of collateral damage also, which of course means innocents die. So Robin Cook, former British Foreign Secretary of the British Empire, he was very high up in the royal or in the British government, and of course he's alleged to have said the so-called Al-Qaeda that we see are actually Kharji's, along with Mossad, CIA, and RAW. RAW, of course, is India, and led and trained mercenary gangs like TTP, who poses Islamic jihadists and create justification for global information war and propaganda to launch a new war against another Muslim country. The truth is, there is no Islamic army or terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, and any informed intelligence officer knows this. But there is propaganda. There is a propaganda campaign to make the public believe in the presence of an identified entity representing the devil, only in order to drive TV watchers to accept a unified international leadership for a war against terrorism. The country behind the propaganda is the U.S. Well, think about it. If this is true, then, and there is no Al-Qaeda, who brought down the towers on 9/11? In other words, why did they kill Princess Lady Di? You think it was just a mishap? I mean, even Prince Harry knows what happened to his mother. He knows they killed her. This is, of course, a private trip that Republican Senator John McCain from Arizona made a secret trip to Syria in 2013 to meet with freedom fighters. He basically, in other words, these guys are from Al Qaeda. These guys, Abu Musa, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Muhammad Noor, these people actually were some of the people that we were trying to kill. About truth that people have is so gullible. Who do you believe? Who do you trust? Do you trust your government so emphatically that you are willing to just look the other way when you see this kind of thing? You think it's isolated incidents? DARPA, of course, is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Remember, they are the ones who basically drove the internet. But DARPA, of course, was created after, and we'll probably talk about this more, but DARPA was created after the Sputnik. After the Sputnik, after the Sputnik flew into orbit, the Russians launched Sputnik in 1957, I think it was. They basically used that scare as a way to create NASA, DARPA, the National Endowment of Education or something for the defense in DA, or anyway, it's the defense education bill. It was an education bill back in 1958. I don't remember what it's actually called, but the Mike McKibben is the founder or the leader of. He's the CEO of Leader Technologies Incorporated, or sometimes called Leader. Was founded in 1997 by veteran entrepreneur Michael T. McKibben, headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. He had come from the background at AT&T, where he led the redevelopment of their Windows messaging system in cooperation with AT&T Labs. Well, he, of course, alleges that James P. Chandler III, he was a Clinton national advisor in the Clinton White House. He basically was the patent attorney for Leader. He accuses James P. He accuses James P. Chandler of taking his work at Leader Technologies and basically giving it to DARPA. You say, well, that's a really wild story, Kevin. That can't be. But remember, Leader Technologies' fight for justice in Leader versus Facebook is not only a fight on behalf of shareholders, but for every American. Because in the case, they pretty much showed that, well, the timelines do fit. In other words, Facebook probably is not Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook, it was actually their creation. In other words, all their work at Leader Technologies was in fact what Facebook became. And in fact, this meme was posted on the internet. This meme was posted by Edward Snowden. This meme was posted by Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden basically, it seems to agree with Michael McKibben, because he's basically acknowledging that, hey, Project LifeLog, the DARPA project that was basically mirroring or basically the same thing, trying to, in other words, if you want intel, you want data on everybody in the world, rather than you go collect the data, just create a place to where they come to you and give you the data. Well, that's Facebook. People post, their own shopping habits, their own what they bought, what they did, what they, where they went, their vacation pictures, their wedding pictures, you name it. People post everything at Facebook. So Project LifeLog is Facebook. It basically was in other words, the very day that they killed Project LifeLog is the same day that Facebook was created. And of course, like I said, who found that? Who posted that online? Edward Snowden. So with intellectual property is, copyrights, patents, trademarks. So if you want a way to fight, like I said, if you want a way to fight these people who use money as leverage, just get rid of the money. This is my friend and mentor, Robert David Steele. This is from 2018, one of the last times I came back to the States. He, of course, wrote a book called The Open Source Everything Manifesto. He was also our champion in America for open source intelligence. And because he's been giving speeches and briefings on open source intelligence for decades, since the 1980s. So he even ran for president once, and he was even nominated for a Nobel Prize. So he was, like I said, a champion of the people in the United States. This, of course, is Marcin Jakubowski. He had a TED Talk. He, of course, started open source ecology and maybe the Global Village construction set. When Robert talked about Marcin, he always talked about him very fondly. I remember that, and I very much admired his work. But I'll let you see part of what, well, hit some of his TED Talk. But this is Marcin Jakubowski.
My name is Marcin. I'm a farmer, technologist, born in Poland, now in the US. I started a group called Open Source Ecology, and we took on a very big, hairy, audacious goal. We've identified the 50 most important machines that allow for modern life to exist, the things we rely on every day, whether we know it or not. Everything from a tractor, to an oven, to a circuit maker. Then we create an open source, DIY version that anyone can build and maintain at a fraction of the cost. We call this the Global Village Construction Set. Are we reinventing the wheel here? Well, yes. So let me tell you a story. I finished my 20s with a PhD in fusion energy, and I discovered that I was useless. I had no practical skills. The world presented me with options, and I took them. I guess you can call it the consumer lifestyle. So I started a farm in Missouri and learned about the economics of farming. I bought a tractor, then it broke. I paid to get it repaired. Then it broke again. And pretty soon, I was broke too. I realized that the truly effective, low-cost tools that I needed to build a sustainable life and settlement just didn't exist yet. I needed tools that were robust, modular, highly efficient and optimized, low cost, made from local and recycled materials, designed for a lifetime, not obsolescence. I found that I would have to build them myself. So I did just that, and I tested them, and I found that industrial productivity can be achieved on a small scale. So then I published the 3D designs, schematics, instructional videos, and budgets on a wiki. Then contributors from all over the world began showing up, prototyping new machines during dedicated project visits. So far, we've prototyped 8 of the 50 machines, and the project is beginning to grow on its own.
But this is also Marcin Jakubowski.
This cost $60,000. So I built my own for $15,000. And mine is better because I can fix it forever. It's lifetime design. It's also modular, so I can modify it, and I can repair any major problem in 1 hour. With the other brand, I have to throw it out in 5 years. But I didn't just build this. I also built this. I calculated that civilization needs just 50 machines to build everything from scratch. And what people can't believe is that I posted the full plans, designs, instructions on how anyone can build these machines for themselves. All of our designs are open source, which means that people from all over the world develop and share this information with everyone else so that anyone can take them and improve on them, well, for the benefit of everyone. You might be wondering what I even use these machines for. Well, we also created a method where you can build an entire house in just 5 days. You might not need a tractor or a digger, but everyone needs a home. And almost no one can afford to build their own using current methods which are expensive and inefficient. But with the help of the open source community, we apply the same philosophy we used with machines to housing, and it's already working. Here's a house that we're training people to build in only 5 days for sale right now. Again, all the designs and instructions are posted on our website for free. But if you want a hands-on education in how you can take control of your life, on how you can build a house like this in 6 weeks at a fraction of the cost, and learn skills that will last you a lifetime, our next 2-week crash course is open right now. If you want to learn how to build your own expandable, high-quality starter home in 6 weeks, visit opensourceecology.org, link in the bio.
As Robert David Steele always said, the system is rigged. So that's why open source might be a way to actually come out of this. If we can basically demonetize, if we can basically take away their lever, take away their leverage against us, then maybe we can win our freedom. Take away all their power, take away all their leverage, because the thing is they have they have more money than God at the moment. So if you want to learn more about open source, I would suggest maybe looking toward Stephan Kinsella. Stephan Kinsella was a patent lawyer for like 30 years. He has had many speeches at the Mises Institute, I think it's in New Orleans. And of course, may I offer you this anecdote? I couldn't find it online, but I had seen him give a speech about the N95 mask. And when he talked about the N95 mask, we're talking about Stephan Kinsella, he basically said, this is proof or evidence for, he didn't say proof, he said this is evidence for IP actually hinders development rather than encourages it or helps it. Why? Because that's one reason you had a shortage of N95 mask, is because people were scared to produce it because they were afraid to get sued. But if it wasn't for the IP, if it wasn't for the copyright on the N95 mask, people probably would have gone readily developed it and produced it. So when we needed it the most, IP, intellectual property, copyrights, actually hindered progress, hindered our development, hindered our ability to respond to this catastrophe, or if you want to call it a catastrophe. Jacques Fresco, of course, was the gentleman from Peter, I think is it Peter Jackson? Or Jackson Peters? Well, from the movies that actually, or the documentaries, Zeitgeist Addendum. Jacques Fresco has a part in that. He endorses RBE, which is the resource-based economy. In other words, if we are able to demonetize, if we are able to go to what we might call an open source everything model, if we are able to do maybe resource-based economies, that means everything will be rationed. But maybe, in other words, we can't have centralized government. We'll have to decentralize. We'll have to regionalize, if anything. In other words, with true 3D printing, you actually have the possibility and the ability, the feasibility to actually regionalize all production. Don't even worry about economies of scale anymore. Don't even worry about profit anymore. Basically, just distribute the resources. Because if you look, like I said, if you look at that model that we were looking at before, if the anarchists are the ones for the individuals, and then you have trade unions are basically for the direct democracies, maybe we skipped a step. Maybe corporations would probably be more in line with socialism, and maybe government is more communism, and maybe there's something in between, say, the trade unions and, say, corporations. If there is, then these things that we're talking about, maybe like a distribution center. In other words, it is something about, distributing the resources, distributing, how things are made, how we, in other words, if we are trying to be just, if we are trying to be fair, not just with, Americans and Europeans and Asians and, Latin Americans, but everybody. I'm talking about Africans and, I'm talking about every nation on the planet. We don't need them pushing these agendas, which are basically, I would say, Machiavellian. Because if they are basically playing us and basically like Borgia, putting his lieutenant out there so he looks good, just so he's the one committing the crime, so now he can say, oh, okay, I got rid of my lieutenant because he was a bigot, he was a racist, he was a criminal, he was a race, he was a Jew, he was anti-Semitic. Whatever however you want to model people to think people as being bad, basically bad, that can be manipulated, that can be orchestrated, and it has been for millennia. And so I hope people realize that it's time for now is to wake up. People are basically good. People, I've been around the world, worked in a dozen different countries, and I can tell you the fact that it's a fact. Everybody is the same. Everybody just wants to be left alone to their own devices. They want to basically to provide financial security to their families, physical security to their families, and they just want to be left alone. Get out of my way. Allow me to my own devices. Allow me to make my money, to make my, pay my bills, and basically provide for my family. However, you don't even have bills to pay if you're basically doing an RBE, because there is no profit incentive. There is no money. There is no profit. So you might say, oh, well, that basically takes away, any incentive to do anything. Well, why do you do chores? Chores are done. Why do you do chores? You don't want to live in a pigsty. You clean your own house because, it doesn't profit you in any way other than it cleans your house. A chore, around the house is basically done for free. Why? Why do you do chores? So chores are just an example of why people who say, oh no, the society will fall apart without money. Are you sure about that? Are you willing to risk maintaining your slavery, being a serf or a slave to these people, just because you don't want to try something outside the box? You don't want to try something new, because they've been doing the same thing since Socrates. So here is a document from the Midwest Public Hearing on Environment and Development. It's by the state of Iowa, the executive department. It's by the UNA, which is the United Nations Association of Iowa, where they basically provide broad public debate and support for United Nations Earth Summit 1992. In this letter, it was written to Richard Gephardt, and it starts out by saying the time is pressing. The Club of Rome was founded in 1968. Limits to Growth was written in 1971. Global 2000 was written in 1979, but insufficient progress has been made in population reduction. What? This is an actual document. But if you continue, and I can provide this, but this document, that's why I gave you the title, you can find it online. Because on page 4 of 7, I believe it is, it has under what must be done. And under what must be done, it reads, will you take action now? Now that President Bush has the political momentum, or wait until you must convince Americans to fight 100 Vietnams simultaneously? This is the time to save the Anglo-Saxon race and its most glorious production, the Anglo-Saxon system of banking, insurance, and trade. We are the living sponsors of the great Cecil Rhodes' will of 1877, in which Rhodes devoted his fortune to, and I'm going to skip because it ends with, the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. So if this is a hoax, it's a very, very it's not very funny, because I would just say that the Anglo-Saxon banking model in insurance and trade includes IP, includes making money from intellectual property. So, if we look forward then to demonetize, decentralize, maybe regionalize or localize economy, open source everything maybe is the way to go. AI plus robotics, maybe the droid army. AI plus deepfake, building consensus. You're talking about sock puppets. So corporatist, these are the people we're talking about fighting. These are the people who now have power. Remember, Mussolini said, I probably should have called, instead of call my form of government fascism, maybe I should have called it corporatocracy. Why? Because he was saying basically he wanted corporations to help rule or to govern. Well, technically, I guess you could say in the 21st century, we have global fascism because corporations are helping govern around the world. Anyway, this is just part of what I wanted to present to you about Thomas Paine, his economic contributions, because I wanted you to see the model, basically that you can be both, that the round, the circle, basically that can be interpreted as both maybe political. Well, the important thing to take away about the dial, or the model that we can say about, there's two takeaways about the dial for the economic model for Thomas Paine. One is, if you notice, it's a dial. It's a circle. It is not a spectrum. In other words, you can dial it up or down depending on your community, depending on your society. You can dial up or down how do you want to distribute the resources. Because if we can say that a society, or those people who share resources, it just comes down now to how will we decide to distribute those resources. If you basically are now saying, well, our society, we want to do more of it this way, that way. In other words, you can dial it up and down. It's not a concrete thing. It's basically just, okay, well, how far up or how far down do you want to rely on the individual versus, say, government? So you basically can dial it up and down. It is a dial. Also, what the dial shows you is that Karl Marx, if you're really honest with yourself, what you just observed is the fact that Karl Marx was continuing the work of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was who put us on this trajectory for America. It was Karl Marx who basically was saying, okay, if he's right, then maybe we can do it this way. In other words, this model that is on a dial, in other words, we don't have to have capitalism like Adam Smith said. We don't have to have that American model like we have. We can basically adjust it and dial it any way we want. How you decide to distribute your resources in the 21st or 22nd or 23rd century is totally up to you. You do not, in other words, it might not, our fix might not be a political fix. If we fix the institutions of government and try to minimize government, that would be probably the thing that would probably make our forefathers, happy if they're not rolling over in their graves. But if the fix is not political, sure, like I said, you can adjust the fix. In other words, you can minimize government. In other words, make the institutions as small as possible, so that way you give freedom to the people to allow them to have control of their own devices. Then, of course, the economy does not have to be fixed. And what I'm saying is the true fix might be economic change, not political change. Sure, we want our freedom back. We want our country back. That's why I would say I advocate what our founding fathers seem to say. Minimize government. Minimize it. Have it as small as possible. Keep it as small as possible. And I would even go so far as to say, well, maybe even advocate what George Mason said from Virginia. I would just say, okay, not even federalize. Maybe a confederation. In other words, localize and regionalize government. Keep it as small as possible. Have smaller governments around the world, and don't have these big national governments. Is basically, have more of a confederation establishment. In other words, try to keep government small. So if you cannot trust government because government is untrustworthy, because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, minimize the government. What you need to focus on is the economics. How will you decide to distribute resources? How will we, as a species, What will they be saying in the 25th or 30th century when they look back on us and say, well, they did a good job, or they'd be like, oh, well, they started, World War III. The ball's in our court. We have an opportunity to do things that maybe nobody else has ever done. Anyway, next time, what I'll do is we'll talk about identifying the enemy. I've already given you some information about who the enemy is, but let's take a closer look at who the enemy actually is. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully you had as much fun as I did. But that concludes today's episode, and long live the Republic.